Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling something really fundamental, like how we even know what happened in the past.
Yeah, it sounds simple, but it's really not.
Exactly. We've got this document, scope.pdf, which is our starting point. And the mission today is to really dig into what it says about historical knowledge.
Right.
We're asking some big questions like,
Yeah.
how do we actually get a handle on history? How does knowing about the past stack up against other kinds of knowledge? And, why should you even care about this?
And this document, it provides a really good framework for thinking about those things. It's not just about dates and names. It gets into the real foundations of how we understand history.
Okay, so let's dive right in. The first big question, maybe the most basic. Can we actually have knowledge of the past? It seems obvious, but the source gives three, well, frankly, amazing examples to kick us off. First, Richard III, found under a car park in Leicester, 2012.
Yeah, I mean, a car park. It's almost unbelievable.
Right.
And what's so powerful about that case is how different types of evidence just sort of click together. You know, for centuries, there was all this debate, a lot of it colored by Shakespeare's portrayal,
Yeah.
right, about his physical appearance.
Oh, hunchback thing.
Exactly. Then, boom, 21st century science steps in. They exhume the remains. They use carbon dating to make sure they're from the right time period.
Okay.
And then, the really key part, genome sequencing. They looked at the DNA in the bones and matched it to living relatives, a genetic link.
Wow.
And yes, they confirmed the scoliosis. So it's just this stunning example of how, modern science can sometimes solve these really old historical puzzles.
Like cracking a centuries-old cold case.
Yeah.
Okay, then there's the second example, which is also pretty mind-blowing. LiDAR technology in Guatemala, 2018.
Ah, yes. The laser imaging.
Yeah, basically seeing through the jungle canopy and revealing, 60,000 unknown Maya structures? That's huge.
It's incredible. And this is where technology directly backs up historical accounts that people had frankly dismissed.
Yeah.
Well, back in the 16th century, Spanish conquistadors wrote about these vast, sprawling Maya cities. And for a long, long time, historians thought, okay, they were probably exaggerating,
Right, makes sense.
But then LiDAR gives us the visual proof.
Yeah.
It shows these structures were actually there.
Yeah.
So new tools can literally unearth lost history and confirm claims that seemed far-fetched. It shows our ability to know the past isn't static, it grows with technology.
Okay, so science digging things up, technology revealing what was hidden. And the third example is quite different, more recent, and really moving. The hashtag EveryNameCounts project.
The Erlson Archives, 2020 to 2023.
A massive volunteer effort transcribing 29 million Nazi camp records. That number is just hard to grasp.
It really is. And this
Yeah.
one really highlights the human dimension of historical knowledge. These aren't just abstract records. They're documents about individual people's lives, their fates.
Yeah.
And by taking these incredibly fragile documents and turning them into searchable digital data, the project actually allowed families to find information about relatives they'd lost during the Holocaust.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's such a powerful reminder of how dealing with historical documents can have a very real, very emotional impact right now, today.
So we've got a king, an ancient civilization, and Holocaust records. Three really different cases. What's the main point the source draws from these about knowing the past?
I think the core idea is that, look, our knowledge of the past is always mediated. We weren't there, right? We see it through traces, through evidence.
Right. Filtered.
Exactly. But, and this is the crucial bit, it's not fixed. It can be improved.
Yeah.
We can get a better, more nuanced understanding as we find new evidence, like the bones, or develop new methods like LiDAR, or even just process existing information better, like with the archives. History's an ongoing process.
Okay, an ongoing process of discovery. That makes sense. So let's shift gears a bit. How is this knowledge about the past different from, say, scientific knowledge or other ways of knowing? The document points out some key distinctions.
Yeah, it does. And the first one is really fundamental. Irreproducibility.
Meaning you can't do it again?
Precisely. Think about the Great Fire of London in 1666. We can study accounts, look at archaeological finds, but we can't just, set London on fire again to check our theories.
Probably for the best.
Yeah, definitely. But contrast that with, say, Newton's prism experiment. A scientist can replicate that in a lab any time to verify how light splits. Historical events are unique, they're singular. You can't rerun them.
So it's like every historical event is this unique data point we only get to see once. That puts a lot of pressure on interpreting the evidence we do have, doesn't it?
It really does, which leads to the second point. the narrative structure.
Narrative structure, meaning storytelling.
In a way, yes. When historians try to understand something complex, like the 2008 financial crisis, they typically construct a chronological story. They weave together different threads, policy decisions, economic trends, individual actions, cultural factors.
Right, putting it all together in sequence.
Exactly. Whereas an economist looking at the same crisis might create more abstract models, focusing on variables and relationships, maybe de-emphasizing the specific order things happened in. History is often fundamentally about the sequence, the unfolding story over time.
Okay, the story, the sequence. Got it. And what about the raw material, the data itself?
That's the third big difference.
Yeah.
The data is often fragmentary. It's incomplete.
Patchy.
Very patchy sometimes. The document uses the example of trying to figure out population sizes in medieval times using parish rolls.
Yeah.
Records are missing, they're inconsistent.
You can't just count everyone.
Not even close.
Yeah.
Historians have to use techniques like interpolation, basically, making educated guesses to fill the gaps based on what they do know. It's reconstruction,
Right.
which is quite different from, say, climate science using ice cores, where you can get these long, continuous series of numerical data points. Historical knowledge often involves building the most plausible picture from incomplete traces, rather than finding universal laws from complete data sets.
It's like doing a jigsaw puzzle, but some pieces are just gone forever, and maybe some don't quite fit perfectly.
That's a great analogy, actually. Yeah.
Now, the document also points out that, wait a minute, lots of fields deal with the past, don't they? It's not just history.
Oh, absolutely. Many fields engage with their own past. Think about physics. Modern detectors for gravitational waves, like LIGO, they build on earlier experiments, like Joseph Weber's in the 60s, even though Weber's initial results are now seen as flawed.
Okay.
For medicine, HIV treatment protocols today still reference the early AZT trials from 1987 as a sort of baseline, even with all the new mRNA therapies and stuff.
Right, you need that context.
And even art. The source mentions Beyoncé sampling Donna Summer on her Renaissance tour. Critics interpret that partly through the lens of disco history, music history.
Okay, so lots of fields look back, but the source makes a distinction, right? It's not quite the same thing as doing history.
Exactly, that's the crucial point. While all these fields have a past and engage with it, history as a discipline makes the past its primary object of study. A chemist ultimately wants to understand reproducible reactions now. A historian wants to understand the trajectory itself, how things changed over time, why they happened the way they did, how people experienced it. It's about the past for its own sake, in a way.
That makes sense. Which leads to another really interesting question the document explores. Why does history seem to hold this, privileged position when we talk about knowledge? What makes it so important?
The source gives three main reasons, I think. First, contested memory.
Meaning people fight over it.
Pretty much, yeah. Think about how different countries teach the same events. The example given is the portrayal of comfort women during World War II in Japanese versus Korean textbooks.
Ah, okay. A very sensitive topic.
Extremely. And the different narratives aren't just minor disagreements. They show how selecting certain evidence, emphasizing specific perspectives, and frankly, national identity shape how history is written and understood. History is often debated, sometimes fiercely.
So it forces us to confront bias and interpretation.
Right.
Okay, what's the second reason?
The moral stakes involved.
Moral stakes.
Yeah. The document points to Germany's ongoing process of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, coming to terms with the Nazi past.
Right.
That historical understanding directly influences things like their modern immigration policies.
Right.
There's a real ethical weight to understanding that history, and has tangible consequences today. That's quite different from, say, learning algebra. An algebraic proof doesn't usually carry the same kind of direct societal, moral implication.
That's a really powerful point. History shapes our values, our present-day decisions. Okay, and the third reason.
Methodological reflexivity, which sounds complicated, but
Break it down for us.
it basically means history forces us to think about how we know things.
Uh-huh.
The source quotes the historian John Lewis Gaddis, calling history a science of human subjectivity.
Okay.
Because you're dealing with past human actions, intentions, perspectives. You constantly have to grapple with your own biases, try to understand people very different from you. You practice empathy and critically evaluate patchy, often conflicting evidence.
So it makes you more aware of the limits of knowledge.
Exactly. It fosters what the document calls epistemic humility, knowing what you don't know or can't know for sure, and critical literacy, being able to analyze sources and arguments carefully. History is like a training ground for evaluating information.
Okay, so History isn't just about what happened, but how we know and the ethics and biases involved. Now, let's flip that around again. The document asks, to what extent is all knowledge actually historical knowledge?
Yeah, that's a fascinating thought experiment.
How so?
Well, take math. The Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. That's true now. It was true then. Its validity doesn't depend on history.
Right. It's just mathematically true.
But understanding how ancient Mesopotamians figured out relationships in right triangles, their methods, their context, that investigation is historical.
Ah, okay. The process of discovery is historical.
Exactly. Or think about your smartphone. It embodies like 150 years of progress in electrical engineering, physics, material science.
Yeah.
Even if the manual doesn't list the entire history back to the telegraph.
True.
Or, another example, indigenous ecological knowledge. The source mentions Maori Rahui temporary bans on using certain resources. These are often based on centuries of detailed observation passed down through generations. Modern biologists are now realizing this is incredibly valuable long-term data.
So lots of knowledge clearly has a history. But the key question is, does it rely on that history for its validity today?
That's the crucial distinction the source makes. A lot of knowledge has historical roots, but its current validation might come from elsewhere. Like we said, the Pythagorean theorem is validated by mathematical proof, not by historical analysis of Pythagoras or the Mesopotamians. So, while the journey is historical, the destination, the knowledge itself might stand on non-historical ground.
Okay, that distinction is important. Now, this leads to another tricky area, is finding the truth, the one definitive account, the only goal when people study or write history.
That's a really good question, and the source suggests, well, maybe not always.
Oh.
Look at the example of the 1619 Project versus the 1776 Commission in the U.S. Both initiatives claim to be grounded in historical facts.
Right, I remember the controversies.
But they clearly had different aims. They emphasized different aspects of American history, one centering the legacy of slavery, the other focusing more on Enlightenment ideals. And they aimed to teach different civic lessons. The goal wasn't just neutral fact presentation.
So the purpose, the lesson you want to draw, can shape the narrative, even if you're using facts.
Exactly. Or think about truth and reconciliation commissions, like in South Africa after apartheid, or in Canada regarding indigenous residential schools.
Mm-hmm.
Their primary goal wasn't necessarily about achieving perfect courtroom-level factual accuracy on every single event or testimony. It was more about establishing a shared understanding, acknowledging harm, and promoting restorative justice and community healing. Getting the story right enough to move forward, you could say.
So truth matters, but sometimes other goals like justice or healing are foregrounded.
Yes. And one more example, counterfactual history.
Like what-if scenarios.
Yeah. The source mentions Neil Ferguson asking, what if Britain had stayed out of World War I? The point of exercises like that isn't to claim that this alternate scenario is the truth or definitely what has happened.
Right.
It's more about exploring contingency, showing how different choices or chance events could have drastically changed the outcome. It helps illuminate why things happened the way they did by imagining alternatives.
So historians are often balancing things. Factual accuracy is crucial, of course, but they might also be aiming for explanatory power or fostering moral understanding or empathy.
Exactly. It's often a complex mix of goals.
Okay, let's talk about certainty. How sure can we actually be about the past compared to, say, the present or the future? You'd think the past, being done, would be easier to pin down.
You'd think so, but it's often not the case. The source uses the example of the 1918 influenza pandemic in India, trying to figure out the death toll.
Mm-hmm.
Estimates range wildly, from maybe 10 million to 20 million.
Why such a huge range?
Because the colonial records at the time massively undercounted deaths, especially in rural areas. The data is just fundamentally flawed and incomplete.
Okay.
Now contrast that with predicting a future event, like a 5-day weather forecast. Meteorologists can actually give you quantified error bars, ranges of probability.
Right, they tell you the uncertainty.
Or a present event. If there's an earthquake in Tokyo tomorrow, seismographs will give us near-instantaneous, highly precise data about its magnitude and location.
So, ironically, the past can sometimes be less certain than the immediate future or the present.
It can be,
Hmm.
because evidence decays, records get lost, archives could be destroyed or censored. While uncertainty might narrow as a future event gets closer, our window onto the distant past can actually become foggier over time.
That's counterintuitive, but makes sense. Okay, final big question then. What actually counts as a fact in history? How is a historical fact established?
The source gives some helpful examples to think about this, almost on a scale of certainty.
Okay.
At one end, you have something like John F. Kennedy was assassinated on November 22 in 1963 in Dallas. This is about as close to a certain historical fact as you can get,
Why?
because you have massive corroboration from different kinds of primary sources. The Zapruder film, numerous eyewitness accounts, official investigations, forensic and ballistic evidence, they all converge on that core statement.
Okay, convergent evidence. Makes sense. What's an example that's less certain?
How about Spartacus's last stand occurred at the river Silarus. Ancient writers like Appian and Plutarch mention a final battle near a river Silarus, and archaeologists have found Roman military gear from the right period in that general area.
Rip.
But the sources disagree on some details, and the archaeology is suggestive, not definitive proof of that specific battle at that exact spot. So it's considered a probable fact, supported by evidence, but not with the same overwhelming certainty as the JFK assassination.
Right, different degrees of confidence.
Exactly. And a more modern example the source uses is the Panama Papers leak in 2016.
Ah, the huge data leak about offshore accounts.
Right. What turned those initial leaks and allegations into documented fact was the painstaking forensic analysis by journalists. They authenticated the data, time-stamped emails, notarized documents, corporate records, proving the information was genuine and hadn't been tampered with.
So the verification process established factuality.
Precisely. So establishing historical fact isn't usually about finding one single smoking gun or achieving absolute mathematical certainty. It's about building a strong, coherent case through critical source analysis, looking for corroboration between independent sources, and reaching a high degree of probability or confidence.
It's about the weight of the evidence, really.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It deals in well-supported interpretations and degrees of likelihood more often than absolute proofs.
Well, this has been incredibly illuminating. A real deep dive thanks to this scope.pdf document into just how complex and fascinating the whole idea of historical knowledge is.
It really is. It makes you appreciate the challenges, but also the power of trying to understand the past.
Yeah, and I love how the source concludes. It calls history, let me see, both vulnerable because it relies on these fragile traces,
The remnant?
but also uniquely powerful. It calls it a sophisticated technology for time travel via methodical imagination.
That's a wonderful phrase, isn't it? Time travel via methodical imagination.
It really is. It captures that idea of using evidence and critical thinking to access and understand worlds that are gone, which in turn helps us understand our own world and maybe even think about the future differently.
Absolutely.
So something for all of you listening to think about. How do you engage with history, with information about the past in your own life? Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.